Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are on lesson 3 of Paul's second epistle to Thessalonica, and we're covering 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 5 through 12, and this one's called A Strong Delusion. In our previous study, Paul mentioned the Antichrist, and we also read a verse from the Apostle John that let us know that in addition to this Satan-led man who will lead the world and oppose God during the tribulation, there also is a spirit of Antichrist that exists in this world. The spirit of Antichrist is anyone who opposes God or denies the redemptive work of Jesus. There are other names given in the Bible to the Antichrist. Here in 2 Thessalonians, Paul referred to him as the man of lawlessness, also called the man of sin in some translations of the Bible. Paul also referred to him as the son of perdition. As mentioned in our previous study, perdition is a state of spiritual ruin and specifically refers to the location of spiritual damnation, hell. The son of perdition is the son of Satan. Satan frequently attempts to copy God, and as Jesus is the Son of God, Satan's son will be the Antichrist. He is referred to as the beast in Revelation by the Apostle John, and as the little horn by the prophet Daniel in his prophetic Old Testament book. Zechariah called him the idle shepherd in his prophetic book. Let's read our passage today. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 5 through 12 says this. Do you not remember that when I was still with you, I told you these things? And now you know what is restraining, that he may be revealed in his own time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth that they might be saved. And for this reason God will send them strong delusion, that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. In the 17th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, we learned that Paul spent 3 Sabbaths in Thessalonica, and some believe that he may have spent as much as 3 months there based on his thanks to the Church of Philippi for supporting him while he was preaching in Thessalonica. Some believe that if Paul received financial help there from Philippi, it would have taken more time to let them know he was there. But we know that he was there for 3 Sabbaths. He did not spend a lengthy amount of time in Thessalonica, but we can see from this passage that even in that short duration, Paul taught them about the end times. Some churches never get past the basics, but Paul taught new believers some of the carne asada of the Bible. I think that every generation seems to think that they could be in the final generation, the one that will see the Antichrist and the return of Jesus. But certainly, there have been some events that seem to make this more likely. World War I comes to mind, because rather than a localized event, it affected much of the world. But World War II took this to another level, particularly with Adolf Hitler's demonic emphasis on eradicating the world of all Jews. In the current Christian culture, the return of the Jews to the nation of Israel heightened our awareness of end times prophecy as well. But there are Christians called preterists who believe that the book of Revelation's prophetic words all were fulfilled in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple and either killed, enslaved, or deported all the Jews from Israel. In order to believe that Revelation has all been fulfilled involves either a complete lack of logic or spiritualizing an inordinate number of verses. Instead of believing that as fantastic as some of those verses sound, they are still truth. Here is perhaps the most obvious verse that we can know has not yet been fulfilled. Revelation 21:1 says, "Now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there was no more sea." Obviously, the oceans still exist and never have ceased from existing. Back to my original point, though, Paul considered this teaching to be necessary in the lives of all believers. And if he taught this to the new believers in his 3 weeks in Thessalonica, Paul certainly considered this to be a necessary part of their walks with Jesus. Why exactly? Well, personally, I would say that at least part of that mentality has to do with our need to have hope and faith. With the many difficulties that we will face, God has a purpose and a plan for our eternity with Him. In the same way that school children look forward to summer, and people who have worked all their lifetimes look forward to retirement, all believers who live on a sinful earth have heaven to look forward to, a place without sin. All we have to do is read the book of Revelation and see how it all will come to an end. Satan's battle against God began before the first sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and their battle continues today. That gives us a much better idea when we are told that God is slow to anger. God could have punished Satan at any time, and it still amazes me that after the Great Tribulation, God will chain Satan for 1,000 years, and God will let Satan loose for one last hurrah, one last display in his arrogant rebellion against God. Verse 6 in this passage references a force that is restraining, and that restraint is holding back the Antichrist from the events prophesied about in Revelation. While verse 6 referred to this as a force, verse 7 personified this force and gave that force the pronoun of he. Interestingly, different scholars have identified this restrainer as the Catholic Church, the Pope, the Church as a whole, and even Satan. But the restrainer sure seems to be the Holy Spirit. First of all, understand what the Holy Spirit is doing presently, dwelling within each and every true believer and follower of Jesus. Additionally, the Holy Spirit draws people to Jesus and testifies of Jesus. And with the fruit of the Spirit given to all believers, all the good in all the world can be attributed to the Holy Spirit. This passage in 2 Thessalonians also is one of the reasons that many believe in the pre-tribulation rapture. And let me explain why. If the Antichrist will not begin his world dominance and subsequent attack on every aspect of God until after the restrainer has been removed, it seems likely that the removal of the church and the removal of believers are a single event. This seems to point to a pre-trib rapture. For if all Spirit-filled believers have been removed from the earth, then the Holy Spirit dwelling within those believers will be removed with those believers. I had a discussion with a pastor who believes that no one will be saved in the tribulation. And part of his reasoning has to do with this verse, along with this passage from Matthew 24. Matthew 24, verses 21 through 22. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. It seems that he has emphasized the phrase, no flesh would be saved, without reading the rest of Matthew 24, or even the rest of that sentence. But he has combined this with this verse in 2 Thessalonians. He who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. Does this mean that the Holy Spirit will no longer operate on earth after the rapture? Well, the Bible teaches us about these ministries that will occur during the tribulation and the great tribulation. A remnant of 144,000 Jews, 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, will preach the gospel all around the world, to every nation, every tribe, and to every language. And we can see that there are tribulation saints in heaven from all of these nations, tribes, and languages who have come to Jesus and have been martyred on earth and are in heaven. There also will be 2 witnesses in Jerusalem, and the entire world will be aware of their ministry, their words, their subsequent deaths, and their resurrections before they return to heaven. After the abomination of desolation, the Antichrist will declare war on all followers of Jesus. And if the church was removed before the tribulation, then obviously there will have to be people who will have turned to Jesus since that event. If there are believers on earth, they had to be drawn by the Holy Spirit, and every believer is indwelled with the Holy Spirit. That will include during the tribulation. Why would God have the whole world endure his 21 judgments if at the end, every one of them would die and go to hell? Why wait 7 years? Why have half of the world's population die before the end if God will simply kill the rest at the end? Wouldn't it be merciful to do that to all? In verse 8, we see how this will end. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will consume with the breath of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. On the plains of Megiddo, the Antichrist will gather together all the armies of the world against God. Once again, Armageddon comes from the Hebrew word har, meaning hill, and the town's name of Megiddo. Armageddon. Har Megiddo is the hill of Megiddo, which gives a bird's eye view of the location that Napoleon Bonaparte called the world's most natural battlefield. Jesus will come on a white horse, according to Revelation 19, and it sounds like every believer will join him as members of the army of heaven. The way I picture this may be different, but without a blow-by-blow description in Revelation, this is how I imagine it happening. There was an interesting event described by the Apostle John in his gospel that occurred when the Jewish leaders and their goons came to arrest Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. John 18, verses 4 through 6 says this: Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, "Whom are you seeking?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now when he said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Once again, every time we see an italicized word in the Bible, it is because the translators have added that word to help it to make sense in our language. Jesus did not say, "I am he," in either statement here. He said, "I am." And I am is the name of God that God gave to Moses at the burning bush. When Jesus stated this in the Garden of Gethsemane, the troops drew back and fell to the ground. It sounds like they toppled over like bowling pins. Jesus does not need our physical presence at Armageddon to win that battle. He doesn't need our swords, guns, or martial arts. We will be there as eyewitnesses, and I suspect that he will say, "I am," and will vanquish all enemies. Ehyeh in Hebrew. Let's look a little more closely at the next passage. The coming of the lawless one is according to the working of Satan, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, and with all unrighteous deception among those who perish, because they did not receive the love of the truth, that they might be saved. When we think of the ministry of Jesus while he was on this earth, we remember his power, his signs, and his wonders. Those miracles were to identify him as God. And that is what drew Nicodemus to Jesus. But for most, they wanted to see his miracles and even experience his miracles. but they were not drawn to Jesus. That is both surprising and sad. This makes me think of the miraculous feeding of the 5,000 told about in John 6. After Jesus departed, the crowd followed him to the other side of the Sea of Galilee and asked him for breakfast. Jesus told them that they only were following him for free food. John 6:26 says this, Jesus answered them and said, "Most assuredly I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled." They wanted to see the miracles, to be wowed, but they were not interested in the spiritual food that Jesus gave. What we also need to understand is that Satan also has power, though not as much power as God. Satan also has the ability to perform signs and lying wonders. Think about Moses in Egypt. When Moses threw down his staff, it became a snake. The magicians of Egypt used their demonic powers to copy this miracle, also throwing down staffs and having them become snakes. But don't forget, the snake from Moses devoured the other snakes. The power of God is much greater than the power of Satan. In the tribulation, many will be led astray by the signs and lying wonders of the Antichrist. And as he will claim to be God, many will be fooled by that description. Let's read the next passage. And for this reason, God will send them a strong delusion that they should believe the lie, that they all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. Could God force people to worship him? Of course he could. After all, God is all-powerful. But God's interpretation of love is quite different than man's interpretation of love. God has demonstrated his love for us, and that love is not based on what we have either earned or deserved. But still, God loved us so much that he sent his only Son to die for us and pay the price for our sin. But God will not force us to accept that amazing gift. For those of us who have chosen to receive that gift and to love God in return, he has promised us a future and a hope. But for those who have chosen not to believe God's truth, but instead to believe Satan's lies, God will give them up to their own delusions. He won't force his own truth upon them, or even force them to think through their choices again. In the Old Testament, we can read about God hardening the heart of Pharaoh, while there are also other verses stating that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. There's an old saying that the same sun that melts the butter hardens the clay. God can melt our hearts with his love, but that same love can turn the hearts of many to stone. We can see many people today who have heard the gospel and think it is the biggest fairy tale ever created. At least that is what they claim. But for many of those who oppose God and oppose the Bible, they have chosen that stance simply because they want to do what they want to do. They see the Bible as a rule book. This delusion sent from God to the followers of the Antichrist is God's judgment on those who believe the lie. The lie is that the Antichrist is God instead of Jesus. Some people misread this to think that God is causing harm to innocent people, but these people are far from innocent. As God is outside of time, he knows every person who ever will choose to come to him, and he also knows those who never will choose to do that. Another example would be God telling the children of Israel to put to death those who inhabited the land of Israel before the Jews. If God knows those people never would turn to him, this is an example of God's mercy to shorten their lives, instead of allowing them to wallow in sinfulness for many years to come. But in the tribulation, God will allow the majority of people to reject God's truth, accept the lies of the Antichrist, and follow the Antichrist and Satan all the way to hell. All of these people have chosen to have pleasure in their own unrighteousness. That is the secret ingredient that Satan added to sin to make it even more palatable. Pleasure. If sin was not accompanied by pleasure, it would not draw us back to it magnetically. But remember, sin does not remain filled with pleasure. The first trip on heroin might begin as very pleasurable, but it does not take much time before that same heroin stops a person's heart and kills them. Getting drunk might be loads of fun at first, but when it becomes the focus of a person's life and they lose their spouse, their house, and their liver, that initial fun doesn't last forever. But the truth will last forever, and if we follow the truth, we will live forever as well. Knowing in advance that these events definitely will happen should encourage us to live godly lives and to love and encourage others that Jesus is the only answer. We don't know when the rapture will occur. We don't know when the tribulation will begin. But what we do know is that every day is one day closer. Paul thought this was important information for the new believers in Thessalonica. Certainly, it is even more important today. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.